Hi, welcome to episode 16 of Pink's Picks Recommendations from a Retired English Teacher. Today's nonfiction title, Isaac Storm, A Man, a Time, and the Deadliest Hurricane in History. I actually met Erik Larson, the author, at a reading festival that I attended specifically to hear him speak. I had previously read his The Devil in the White City, a gripping account of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, juxtaposed with that of a serial killer who used the event to lure unwitting victims. I'd also read his eye-opening in The Garden of Beasts, set in Berlin in 1933, featuring the U.S. ambassador and his family and foretelling Hitler's rise to power. In the flesh, Larson is really funny, a witty raconteur. On the page, he has that enviable ability, like a Malcolm Gladwell, to put a new spin on an old subject. In this case, a century-old natural disaster. Further, his research here, 50 pages of footnotes and sources, whittled down to 273 pages of text, which is material that he gleaned mostly from Isaac's memoir, archives of the Weather Bureau housed in the National Archives Annex outside of Washington, D.C., Clara Barton's papers, and Galveston's very own Rosenberg Library, where he read hundreds of letters and personal accounts and filtered through 4,000 plus photos. He also used a detailed fire insurance map from 1899, which he features in this piece, so that we can see exactly where some of the people whom he writes about lived. According to the NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, tropical storms and hurricanes were tracked by year and in the order in which they occurred. But over time, it was learned that the use of short, easily remembered names reduces confusion when two or more tropical storms are brewing simultaneously. Thus, in 1953, female names came into use. Then, 25 years later, male names were added. The World Meteorologic Organization strictly selects the names, and after a particularly bad storm, that name is retired. The storm that made landfall in Galveston, Texas on September 8th, 1900 had no name. It is actually Erik Larson who named it for Isaac Cline, the 38-year-old resident meteorologist at the time. Isaac was not just a weatherman, he was also a physician who became a pioneer in medical climatology, the study of how weather affects people. A tradition started by Hippocrates, who believed climate determined the character of not only men, but nations as well. The United States Weather Bureau's men stationed in Cuba said that this particular storm was, quote, nothing to worry about. But Cuba's own weather observers who pioneered hurricane detection disagreed. And the U.S., in fact, banned all cables about weather except from the U.S. Weather Bureau. So that I found very, very interesting that there was some knowledge about this impending storm, but because it came from Cuban sources as opposed to U.S. sources, the warnings were ignored. For Isaac, this particular storm, he says, always in the past he had been able to separate himself from the meteorological events he described. Hot winds, paralyzed fish. He was the observer, looking upon these phenomena through glass. But this storm had dragged him to its heart and changed his life forever. In Galveston at that time, on September 8th, 1900, it was known to many as the Western Ellis Island. The nation was swollen with pride and technological confidence when nature itself seemed no great obstacle. So there was a complacency, if you will, similar to a decade plus later with the sinking of the Titanic, where man had made so many advances with technology that they were ignoring nature instead of still realizing just how incredibly devastating nature can be. Galveston was the biggest cotton port in the U.S. at that time. It was the third busiest port overall, including that White Star Line that owned the Titanic. Galveston was in a race with Houston to dominate the Gulf, but it had no seawall. Larson begins this book with an actual track of the hurricane. Then he moves on with a map of Galveston at the time, which helps us again to understand where people lived, the bay as opposed to the Gulf of Mexico. And also this is based, as I said, on that fire insurance map in the very beginning. He continues then with a telegram sent from the United States Weather Bureau in Washington to Galveston, and then he continues with chapters dedicated to weather forecasting, the history of meteorologic events, the butterfly effect, the genesis of this particular storm with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and gusts at 200 miles per hour, which ultimately wiped out most of Galveston and killed somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people. It's just absolutely unbelievable. And Larson writes a description of um, watching the hurricane. The houses fell gracefully at first. One witness, watching the same thing happen in his neighborhood, said houses fell into the Gulf as gently as a mother would lay her infant in the cradle. It was when the current caught them and swept them away that the violence occurred, with bedrooms erupting in a tumult of flying glass and wood, rooftops soaring through the air like monstrous kites. Larson's writing is absolutely beautiful. His similes and his metaphors I find very, very clever in all of his writing. This book, with all of its scientific detail, for me, who doesn't have much of a science background, I found a little bit of it not as exciting as perhaps the two previous books that he wrote that I mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a B. It was still very good and well worth the read, particularly now during the middle of hurricane season. We just had Isaias, which passed, and so again, very, very compelling read. Next time, I am going to be talking about the 7 or 8 deaths of Stella Fortuna. So until then, stay healthy, keep reading, and do your homework.